All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going way back to the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
A really pivotal moment in the fight for American independence, actually, the
Right.
Battle of Long Island.
Wait, wait.
You shared some really cool historical accounts with me about this battle, and I'm excited to kind of dig in. Really, our mission today is to unpack what exactly happened and see what it tells us about, those early, really uncertain days of the Revolution.
Yeah. No, this was a major turning point in the war, right?
Mhm.
It wasn't just some small skirmish. It was fought on August 27th, 1776, so pretty early on,
Yeah.
and in what's now, Brooklyn.
Wow.
Um, and it was the first major engagement after the Declaration of Independence. So think about that. I mean, things are really just getting going at this point. And, when you look at the actual number of soldiers involved, it was the biggest single battle of the entire war.
Wow. So really set the stage. I mean, after the, Americans won in Boston, Washington really recognized how important New York City was,
Oh, huge.
especially the harbor there for the British, with their Royal Navy.
Right.
So he moves the Continental Army south. You can almost picture it, can't you? Like the summer of 76, these two armies kind of facing each other across the water, the Americans and the British, led by General William Howe. I mean, why was New York so important, strategically speaking?
Well, I mean, if the British took control of New York City, it would have given them a real foothold.
Yeah.
Their fleet could have been stationed right there in the harbor. And what that means is that they could easily resupply, project power up and down the coast.
Right, right. Makes sense.
It also had the potential to kind of geographically split the colonies,
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
isolating New England from the rest.
Wow.
So for Washington, holding New York was key to kind of keeping the momentum that they had gained in Boston.
Right, yeah. And deny the British all those advantages you're talking about.
Exactly.
Now, the British had landed on Staten Island back in July, and they were being reinforced, like, constantly. Must have been a pretty intimidating sight for the American forces.
Yeah.
And, at this point, the British actually tried to, like, communicate directly with Washington.
Right.
But they address him as George Washington, Esquire.
Yeah.
Because they didn't recognize his rank as commander of the army, so Washington refuses to even accept these letters.
Right.
And I think that little detail just shows how big of a political gap there was between the two sides.
It really does. It's like, do the British even think the American cause is legitimate?
Right.
Do they acknowledge its leadership?
Right.
By not, calling Washington by his proper title, it was like they were saying that the Continental Congress and its army, like it was all a joke.
Right, right. So Washington knows that an attack is coming, and he starts fortifying New York City and Brooklyn Heights. They build all these forts, Fort Sterling, Fort Putnam, Fort Greene, Fort Knox,
Yeah.
and they're all in Brooklyn. And then they put cannons, all over Manhattan, Governor's Island. They even try sinking some old ships to block the British ships from getting in.
Wow.
Were these forts kind of meant to be like the main line of defense, or were they more of a fallback position?
Well, initially, the plan was to make a stand at the Guan Heights, those hills that kind of run through Kings County.
Right.
The terrain there would have given them an advantage, forced the British to attack uphill, hopefully inflict a lot of casualties. The forts at Brooklyn Heights, they were kind of meant to be a backup plan, retreat there if things went south on the heights.
Okay, that makes sense.
The problem was the Americans just didn't have enough troops to really defend that whole front line, the whole Guan Heights. When you look at the numbers, the Americans had like 19,000 troops, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
The British and the Hessians, those are the German mercenaries fighting for the British.
Right.
Together, they numbered around 32,000. So a big disadvantage for the Americans.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, the British eventually make their move. On August 22nd, they land a huge force at Gravesend Bay on Long Island.
Mm.
And Washington initially thinks, oh, this is a feint. This is just a diversion, trying and draws attention away from Manhattan.
Right.
So he only sends a limited number of reinforcements over to Brooklyn.
Uh-huh.
But the plan was to try to defend those Guan Heights, hopefully inflict some serious losses on the British with the terrain advantage, and then fall back to those stronger fortifications at Brooklyn Heights. There were three main passes through the heights that the Americans were focusing on defending.
Right.
Gowanus Road to the west, Flatbush Road in the center, and then further east you had Bedford Pass.
Yeah, yeah. And those passes were the most obvious routes through the hills.
Right.
So if they could control them, it would make it a lot harder for the British to advance on Brooklyn Heights.
Makes sense.
The problem was the American forces were stretched pretty thin trying to cover all three. Right.
So each pass was only lightly defended.
Okay. So this is where things get interesting.
Yeah.
Because the British, they find a way around those main defenses.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. General Clinton gets some intel from some local loyalists. Those are the American colonists who stayed loyal to the British crown.
Right.
And they tell him about the Jamaica Pass. This was a much less guarded route further east.
Oh, interesting.
It's like, imagine trying to attack a fort head-on,
Right.
and a flanking maneuver is like sneaking around the side to hit them where they least expect it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So Clinton comes up with this plan. He's going to march his main force through this unguarded pass at night and completely outflank the American army.
Wow.
And to keep the Americans busy, General Grant, he leads a smaller force in a frontal attack as a distraction. This element of surprise, it was absolutely crucial to the British success.
Wow. So picture this. It's August 26th. It's nighttime. And General Clinton, he's leading this army of like 10,000 British troops on a night march.
But they're not just like bumbling around in the dark. They've got local loyalist farmers guiding them.
Right.
And to make things even trickier, they leave their campfires burning.
Oh, wow.
Trying to, make the Americans think that everything's quiet and normal.
Mhm.
And then, just to add to the drama, you've got this tavern keeper, William Howard, and his son. They're forced to guide the British along this path that goes around the Jamaica Pass.
Oh, man. It's a pretty tragic story, actually. According to the accounts, Howard and his son, they didn't have a choice. They were basically forced to lead the British right through.
Oh, wow.
And, the American militia who were supposed to be guarding that Jamaica Pass,
Yeah.
they got captured without even firing a shot.
Oh, no.
They thought the approaching troops were their own.
Wow.
Clinton, he questions them, confirms that the pass is lightly defended, and by daybreak, boom, the British are through. They stop for a bit to rest up, and then they get ready to launch their main attack. I mean, think about it. That night march, it was a pretty amazing feat of logistics and secrecy.
Totally. And meanwhile, before this flanking maneuver is even finished, General Grant, he kicks off his diversionary attack. And it starts near the Red Lion Inn.
Oh, yeah.
This initial skirmish pushes the American pickets back, and then further north along Gowanus Road, American forces under Lord Stirling, they clash with Grant's troops.
Right.
And there's intense fighting around places like Blockjeeburg and Battle Hill. The Americans, they actually managed to inflict a lot of casualties on the British. At one point, they even thought they'd killed General James Grant.
Really?
Yeah. So it sounds like, at least on that front, the resistance was pretty fierce.
It was. Stirling's forces, which had troops from Delaware and Maryland, they put up a really good fight. They found some good high ground and were able to hold off those first British attacks. What's interesting is that Stirling and his men, they had no idea about that big British maneuver happening to their east.
Right.
They were so focused on the fighting right in front of them, and they were doing pretty well, they thought they might actually be winning that part of the battle.
And then it all changes, right?
Yeah.
The British flanking force, they reach the American rear, and at 9:00 a.m., they fire these signal cannons.
Right.
That was the signal for the Hessian forces to attack the American center at Battle Pass. General Sullivan was in command there.
Right.
So while the Americans are holding their own on the Gowanus Road, this crucial flanking maneuver is unfolding to their east, and then the British, they launch their main attack. What happens next?
So those Hessian troops, they hear the signal cannons, and they start advancing on Battle Pass. General Sullivan, he realizes what's happening. There's this whole British force coming at him from behind. So he's got to quickly reposition his troops to meet this new threat. This leads to some really heavy, confusing fighting.
Wow.
The American forces are basically caught between these two advancing enemy columns, and under this pressure, their left flank starts to crumble. It was total chaos, heavy losses on both sides, units trying to maneuver, fighting in multiple directions at once.
And in all this chaos, you've got the incredible story of the Maryland 400, those Maryland troops.
Right. Lord Stirling, he leads this group in a desperate rearguard action.
Yeah.
And it happens near the Vecta Cortelyou house today that's known as the Old Stone House. They knew they were sacrificing themselves to buy time for the rest of the American forces to try and escape across Brower's Mill Pond. What can you tell me about their actions and, why were they so significant?
Well, the Marylanders, they launched several attacks, like really determined attacks accounts, say at least 2 big charges. And they're attacking this huge British force, well over 2,000 men, with artillery support.
Wow.
I mean, they knew they were facing impossible odds. They suffered devastating losses. Most were killed or captured. But their incredible bravery bought precious time for the rest of Sterling's command to pull back and avoid being completely wiped out. Washington actually saw this heroic stand from a distance and was really moved by it. He said something like, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." Really shows the human cost of the battle.
And the incredible courage of these soldiers. They knew they were probably going to die, but they fought anyway. Their sacrifice became this symbol of American bravery, this refusal to give up, even in the face of defeat.
Yeah, it's powerful. And around the same time, 9:00 a.m., Washington arrives from Manhattan. He sees just how bad the situation is. This was no feint. He orders more troops over from Manhattan to Brooklyn, but by then, it's pretty dire. His army, they're facing being surrounded.
Yeah, they were in a really bad spot, trapped basically with the East River behind them.
Right.
But then General Howe does something unexpected. He makes a decision that ends up saving the Americans. Instead of attacking the American forces who had retreated back to Brooklyn Heights, he stops. He decides to start a siege.
Wow.
And historians, they still debate why he did that.
Really? What are some of the theories?
Well, some think that Howe, he'd already inflicted a lot of casualties on the Americans.
Right.
Maybe he didn't want to launch a bloody frontal assault on those fortified positions. Maybe he remembered Bunker Hill, all those British losses there.
Makes sense.
He might have figured, look, the Americans are trapped. They're going to have to surrender eventually. Why risk more of my men? Another theory is that Howe, he still hoped for some kind of negotiated peace, maybe.
Right.
And he didn't want to crush the Americans completely. He thought that might make them even more determined to fight. Whatever the reason, this pause gave Washington and his army a chance, a lifeline.
Yeah, a huge opportunity.
And it makes you think, right? In war, there's this balance between trying to completely destroy your enemy and minimizing your own losses.
Right.
How he was being cautious, but that caution, it allowed the American resistance to continue. And that, in the long run, might have actually made the war last longer.
Wow.
Interesting, isn't
Yeah,
it?
really interesting. So Washington, he knows they could get completely trapped, right?
Yeah.
The East River is their only way out. So he makes a really strategic decision, a really risky decision. He decides to evacuate the entire army and all their supplies to Manhattan.
Yeah.
And the way they pulled it off is just amazing.
It really is. It's this incredible story of military coordination and, honestly, just plain luck.
Right.
So picture it. It's the night of August 29th, going into the 30th. It's dark, and a really thick fog rolls in, like unusually thick. And that fog, it blankets the whole area.
Wow.
And under this cover, General John Glover and his Massachusetts troops, a lot of them were sailors and fishermen, from those coastal towns.
Yeah, it makes sense.
They start using these flat-bottomed boats, probably the kind they'd normally use for hauling goods and livestock.
Right.
And they silently ferry, get this, 9,000 troops, their artillery, horses, everything they need across the East River.
Wow.
And they did it without losing a single man or any significant equipment. The rear guard, led by General Mifflin at first. They kept the British from noticing what was happening. They kept their campfires going, acted like everything was normal, and delayed any British scouts.
Wow. I mean, imagine the British the next morning. They wake up and the whole American army has just vanished.
I know, they were totally stunned. The Battle of Long Island, it was definitely a win for the British, right?
Yeah.
They took control of New York City and Long Island, which they held on to for the rest of the war.
Right.
There were celebrations back in London.
Yeah, of course.
But Washington's retreat, it's seen as a remarkable military achievement. I mean, he saved the Continental Army from being destroyed.
Yeah, and it really showed that the British weren't going to have an easy time winning this war.
Exactly.
New York City, it became a crucial British base.
Yeah.
Used it for the rest of the conflict, a big center for spies and intelligence gathering. But the battle had a huge psychological impact on the Americans, too,
Sure.
Showed them the challenges they were facing, that their army was less experienced, less equipped, and the casualties were really heavy.
Yeah.
Especially for those Maryland troops.
Right.
We still remember their sacrifice today. And a lot of the American soldiers who were captured, they were put on British prison ships, those horrible ships anchored in the harbor. And the conditions were so bad that a lot of them died. Disease, mistreatment, just awful.
It's a dark chapter.
It really is. And it's so important that we still remember this battle. And we do. There are monuments and historical sites all over the place, like the Minerva statue in Greenwood Cemetery. It's positioned so that she's looking out towards the Statue of Liberty.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
And then there's the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument, a memorial to those who died in captivity. The old stone house museum that's on the very spot where the Marylanders made their last stand.
Right.
In Prospect Park, there are markers there, including one specifically for the Maryland troops.
Hmm.
It's also kind of cool that some units in the U.S. Army today, they can trace their lineage back to the soldiers who fought at Long Island.
Wow, that's incredible. Even though the Americans lost the battle, Washington's retreat, it kept the Continental Army going. If Howe had attacked, maybe captured or destroyed a big chunk of the army, who knows what would happen?
Right.
Maybe the war would have been over right then and there. In a way, that retreat, even though it was a retreat, it was a victory for the American cause.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It allowed the revolution to keep going. So, in this deep dive into the Battle of Long Island, we've seen a British victory that wasn't as simple as it seemed.
Yeah.
And we saw Washington's amazing retreat, which was really key. The battle showed us how the Continental Army was still learning, still growing.
Right.
It showed how important intelligence and surprise are in war.
Oh, yeah.
And we saw the incredible bravery of the American troops, especially the Maryland 400. Now you've got a much deeper understanding of this battle, not just the basic facts, but the strategy, the human cost, the impact it had on the whole war.
And hopefully you can see how this one battle, even though they lost, it's full of lessons about leadership, strategy, and the sheer determination of those early Americans.
Exactly. Now here's something to think about. What if Howe had attacked those American defenses at Brooklyn Heights? Instead of starting that siege, what if that fog hadn't rolled in, hadn't given the Americans cover for their escape?
Yeah, that's a great point.
History could have been completely different.
Totally. It shows how even small things, like the weather, can have a huge impact on big events. And if you're interested in learning more, I'd definitely suggest looking into the stories of the Maryland 400.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating.
Their courage, their commitment, it's really inspiring. And if you want to understand the really brutal side of the war, read about the conditions on those British prison ships. It's tough to read about, but it's important. There's so much more to discover about this battle.
That's a great point to end on. So much more to learn.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
See ya.